U.S. Enemy Alien Internment Program, Texas, 1945. On July 15, 1945, at Camp Crystal City in southwest Texas, the United States operated one of several internment facilities for German nationals captured during World War II. By war's end, approximately 371,000 German prisoners and civilian detainees were held across American territory, according to declassified War Department records. Camp Crystal City, located 120 miles southwest of San Antonio, housed approximately 3,000 German and Japanese families under the administration of the Immigration and Naturalization Service and the U.S. Army. The facility differed from standard prisoner-of-war camps in a critical aspect. It held civilian internees, families of German nationals arrested under the Enemy Alien Control Program, established by Presidential Proclamation 25/25 in December 1941. These internees included German citizens residing in Latin America who were transported to the United States under diplomatic agreements with countries such as Peru, Brazil, and Argentina. The stated purpose, documented in State Department cables, was to prevent potential fifth column activity and to create a pool for prisoner exchanges with Germany. Camp conditions, as recorded in International Red Cross inspection reports from 1944 and 1945, generally met Geneva Convention standards for civilian internees. Barracks provided basic shelter. Medical facilities operated under U.S. Army supervision. Food supplies followed military ration guidelines, which by 1945 exceeded availability in war-torn Europe by considerable margins. If you appreciate documentary-style World War II history based on primary sources and archival research, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment indicating where you're watching from. We have viewers across 47 countries, and we read every comment. The administrative challenge facing camp commanders in 1945 centered on nutrition, particularly for children. War Department Nutrition Division reports from this period identify protein-calorie malnutrition as a recurring problem among newly arrived internees from displacement camps in Europe and Latin America. Many children arrived already malnourished. The Army's solution involved supplemental feeding programs using readily available calorie-dense American foods. Peanut butter emerged as a central element in these programs. Military provisioners valued it for specific reasons documented in Quartermaster Corps reports. High protein content, approximately 25 grams per 100 gram serving. Calorie density, roughly 590 calories per 100 grams. Long shelf life without refrigeration, and low production cost. By 1945, peanut butter had become a standard component of U.S. military rations and civilian nutrition programs. However, cultural factors complicated its acceptance. German food traditions emphasized different protein sources, dairy products, pork, beef, and legumes prepared as hot dishes rather than spreads. Peanuts held different cultural associations in Central Europe. Agricultural records indicate they were rarely consumed as human food in Germany during this period, instead being used primarily as animal feed or pressed for industrial oil. This cultural divide created tension in American internment camps during 1945. Camp administrators viewed peanut butter as practical nutrition. Many German internees viewed it as evidence of American cultural inferiority. The resulting conflict would have consequences documented in medical records and camp administrative files. German Civilian Internee Culture Camp, Crystal City, 1945. The German internee population at Camp Crystal City in mid-1945 represented diverse backgrounds, according to camp census data maintained by the Immigration and Naturalization Service. Approximately 60% were civilians arrested in Latin America under agreements with host governments. The remaining 40% included merchant seamen captured at sea, diplomatic personnel, and individuals arrested within the United States for suspected enemy sympathies. Educational levels varied considerably. Camp records indicate that roughly 30% of adult internees had completed secondary education in Germany's gymnasium system. Professional backgrounds included teachers, engineers, merchants, nurses, and skilled tradespeople. This relatively educated population maintained strong connections to German cultural identity, documented in camp newspapers and letters preserved in National Archives collections. Social structures within the camp reflected pre-war German society. Informal hierarchies emerged based on education, professional status, and ideological commitment. Former teachers and professionals often assumed leadership roles in organizing camp activities, education for children, and representing internee interests to American administrators. Food became a focal point for cultural expression and resistance. Camp mess halls served American-style meals prepared by Army cooks: scrambled eggs, toast, vegetables, occasional meat, and desserts. Declassified camp reports note that many internees complained about food quality, preparation methods, and ingredient selection. These complaints reflected both genuine cultural differences and a need to assert dignity in captivity. The introduction of peanut butter as a supplemental food in early 1945 triggered organized resistance among some internee groups. Camp administrative correspondence from this period references repeated refusals of peanut butter rations and collective complaints filed with camp commanders. The stated objections focused on taste, texture, and assertions that peanut butter was poverty food, unsuitable for educated Europeans. Historical context explains some of this resistance. German propaganda during the war years had emphasized themes of cultural superiority and derided American culture as materialistic and unsophisticated. These messages resonated with some internees, providing a framework for interpreting their experience. Rejecting American food offered a way to maintain cultural identity and resist psychological defeat. Leadership in this resistance often came from internees with teaching backgrounds. Educational professionals carried cultural authority. Their opinions about proper nutrition and suitable food held weight among other internees, particularly mothers concerned about feeding their children correctly. However, this resistance occurred against a backdrop of worsening conditions in Germany itself. By mid-1945, Germany's food distribution system had collapsed. Allied bombing had destroyed transportation infrastructure. Agricultural production had declined due to labor shortages and disrupted supply chains. Civilian rations in occupied Germany had fallen to starvation levels in many areas. Red Cross correspondence and letters from Germany to Camp Crystal City internees, preserved in archives, described desperate conditions. Urban populations faced severe calorie deficits. Children showed visible signs of malnutrition. Yet in Texas, surrounded by adequate food supplies, some internees refused available nutrition based on cultural objections. This paradox would prove unsustainable. Pediatric malnutrition crisis. Internment camps, 1945 medical records. From American internment camps in 1945, now declassified, reveal a pattern of child malnutrition that alarmed Army medical personnel. Between January and July 1945, camp physicians at facilities across the United States documented increasing cases of protein-energy malnutrition among children of interned families. The medical condition, technically classified as marasmus in severe cases, results from inadequate caloric and protein intake. Symptoms include weight loss, muscle wasting, growth retardation, weakened immune function, and in advanced stages, organ damage. Army medical protocols required regular weight and health monitoring for all internee children under age 12. At Camp Crystal City, medical staff identified 7 children showing clinical signs of malnutrition by July 1945, according to camp health reports. These children, ranging from ages 4 to 11, demonstrated weight-to-height ratios below the 5th percentile and exhibited fatigue, pale coloration, and reduced physical activity. Medical evaluations indicated that while these children received standard camp rations, they were not consuming adequate calories or protein for healthy development. The cause was not food scarcity. Camp supply records show that ration deliveries met or exceeded Army standards throughout 1945. Rather, the problem stemmed from food refusal. Children either rejected unfamiliar American foods or were discouraged from eating them by parents following cultural objections. Army medical officers attempted to address this through supplemental feeding programs. Protocols developed by the War Department's Nutrition Division called for providing calorie-dense foods between regular meals, particularly for underweight children. Peanut butter sandwiches, milk, and fortified foods were standard interventions. However, implementation proved difficult when parents refused to allow their children to consume these supplements. Medical ethics and camp regulations prevented forced feeding except in life-threatening emergencies. Medical staff could recommend nutritional interventions, but cooperation required parental consent. This created an ethical and practical dilemma documented in camp medical correspondence. Physicians recognized that children were suffering from preventable malnutrition. They had access to effective interventions, but cultural resistance from parents limited their ability to implement treatment. The situation required either changing parental attitudes or accepting ongoing child health problems. Camp commanders consulted with the War Department on appropriate responses. Correspondence from this period reveals debate about whether to mandate supplemental feeding as a health requirement or to continue voluntary programs while attempting education and persuasion. The decision was made to increase education efforts while closely monitoring at-risk children. Lieutenant Sarah Bennett, a trauma nurse assigned to Camp Crystal City's medical unit, had experience with malnutrition from her service in field hospitals during the European campaign. Her medical training at Johns Hopkins Hospital, documented in personnel files, emphasized pediatric nutrition. She recognized that the camp's malnutrition problem required not just medical intervention, but cultural change. Bennett's approach, described in camp reports, focused on building relationships with internee mothers, particularly those with professional backgrounds who held influence in the camp community. She organized informal discussions about child nutrition, provided medical literature translated into German, and demonstrated preparation of nutritious meals using available camp foods. The crisis point came in mid-July 1945. A 7-year-old girl collapsed during afternoon recreation period. Medical response was immediate. The child showed signs of severe hypoglycemia and dehydration consistent with advanced malnutrition. Emergency intervention prevented a fatal outcome. The incident would become a catalyst for change in camp food culture. Medical Emergency Child Collapse Camp Crystal City. July 1945 on July 15, 1945, at approximately 3:47 p.m., camp medical personnel responded to an emergency involving a 7-year-old German internee who lost consciousness during recreation activities. Medical reports filed that day described the child as presenting with symptoms consistent with hypoglycemic crisis, secondary to protein-calorie malnutrition. The child, identified in medical records only by initials for privacy, had arrived at Camp Crystal City 6 weeks earlier, following transfer from a displaced persons facility in France. Initial medical screening at intake documented her as underweight for age, weighing 38 pounds against an expected range of 48-52 pounds for a healthy 7-year-old female. Physicians noted her condition but classified it as non-critical, expecting improvement with regular camp meals. Instead, medical weigh-ins over the subsequent 6 weeks showed no weight gain and possible additional loss. The child's mother had declined supplemental feeding programs, stating cultural objections to American foods, particularly peanut butter. Medical staff documented these refusals but, following camp protocols, did not mandate treatment. On July 15th, the child was playing quietly near the recreation building when witnesses reported she suddenly collapsed. An American guard summoned medical personnel immediately. Lieutenant Bennett, the duty nurse, reached the scene within 2 minutes, according to incident reports. Medical assessment indicated the child was semi-conscious, with weak pulse, pale skin, and signs of severe dehydration. Bennett's emergency response, documented in medical notes, included immediate glucose administration. She had a peanut butter and jelly sandwich in her medical kit, part of her personal lunch, and used it to provide rapid-acting sugars and proteins. The intervention proved effective. Within 5 minutes, the child regained consciousness. Color returned to her skin. Her pulse strengthened. Medical monitoring over the next hour showed stabilization, though she remained weak. Bennett ordered transfer to the camp infirmary for overnight observation and nutritional support. This incident occurred in full view of approximately 40 German internee women who were in or near the recreation area. The visible nature of the emergency, a child collapsing, rapid medical response, and recovery after consuming the very food many internees had been rejecting, created what behavioral psychologists would term a cognitive dissonance moment. The child's mother, a former teacher from Hamburg identified in records as having led resistance to camp food programs, faced immediate recognition that her position had endangered her daughter. Other women witnessed clear evidence that the American food they had been taught to despise had saved a child's life. Camp administrators recognized this as a potential turning point. Captain Hayes, the camp commander, consulted with medical staff and decided to convene a mandatory nutrition education session for all German mothers in the camp. The goal was not punishment, but education, using the recent emergency as a teaching opportunity about the serious consequences of inadequate child nutrition. This decision aligned with broader War Department policies regarding internee management. Declassified directives from 1945 emphasized that the purpose of internment was security, not punishment, and that camp administration should work toward eventual reintegration of internees. Education about American society and values was considered part of this process. The medical emergency of July 15th thus became more than an individual health crisis. It represented a collision between ideology and reality, between cultural pride and practical necessity. The camp administration now had both justification and opportunity to address the malnutrition problem directly. Red Cross Communications Germany starvation. 1945, concurrent with the medical emergency at Camp Crystal City, Red Cross Postal Services delivered correspondence from occupied Germany that provided internees with information about conditions in their homeland. These letters, which passed through military censorship but were not suppressed unless containing security-relevant information, described circumstances that contrasted sharply with life in American internment camps. By July 1945, Germany's civilian food situation had reached crisis levels. Allied Control Council reports document that daily caloric availability in urban areas of occupied Germany averaged between 800 and 1,200 calories per person, well below the 2,000–2,500 calories needed for basic health. In some heavily damaged cities, rations fell even lower. Children suffered disproportionately. UNICEF reports from this period, based on surveys conducted in occupied zones, estimated that 30 to 40% of German children under age 10 showed clinical signs of malnutrition by mid-1945. Causes included destruction of food infrastructure, loss of agricultural labor, disruption of distribution networks, and prioritization of resources for Allied forces and displaced persons. Letters from Germany to Camp Crystal City internees, samples of which are preserved in National Archives collections, describe these conditions in personal terms. Family members wrote about standing in bread lines for hours to receive rations of 200 grams of bread adulterated with sawdust. They described children crying from hunger. They reported lack of access to milk, eggs, meat, and fresh vegetables for weeks at a time. One letter, cited in camp administrative reports, came from a woman in Berlin to her sister interned at Camp Crystal City. The letter described twin 5-year-old boys who had become so weak from malnutrition that they no longer had energy to play. The woman wrote in desperation about watching her grandsons deteriorate while their mother, her sister, was safe in American captivity with access to food. The bitter irony was not lost on internees who received such letters. They were living in circumstances that, while restrictive, provided food security far exceeding what their families in Germany experienced. Yet some internees had been refusing available food based on cultural objections, even as their relatives starved. This information arrived at Camp Crystal City during the same week as the child's medical emergency. The combination created what social psychologists would recognize as conditions favorable for attitude change, concrete evidence of harmful consequences, social proof from multiple sources, and emotional motivation to reconsider previous positions. Lieutenant Bennett, aware of the letter's content through her interactions with internee mothers, recognized an opportunity. She obtained permission from camp administration to use anonymized excerpts from the letters as part of the planned nutrition education session. The goal was not to shame internees, but to provide perspective, to help them understand that accepting available food was not cultural betrayal, but practical wisdom. Medical literature on behavior change, available to Army medical personnel through military medical journals of the period, emphasized that effective health education requires addressing emotional and cultural factors, not just providing factual information. Bennett's approach incorporated this understanding. She planned to present not just nutritional science, but also the broader context, that food security was a privilege in war-torn 1945, that children's health requirements transcended national boundaries, and that accepting help did not constitute moral failure. The upcoming education session would test whether this approach could overcome months of established resistance. Nutrition Education Program German internees, July 1945 and July 16, 1945, Camp Crystal City's mess hall was converted into a classroom for a mandatory nutrition education session. All German women internees, approximately 180 individuals, were required to attend. The session was part of standard camp programming, authorized under War Department regulations governing internee welfare and education. Captain Hayes, the camp commander, opened the session by stating its purpose in German. She explained that the previous day's medical emergency had highlighted serious health risks facing children in the camp. She emphasized that the purpose of the session was education, not punishment, and that camp administration's goal was ensuring all children had access to adequate nutrition. Lieutenant Bennett presented the medical portion. Her presentation, prepared with assistance from the War Department Nutrition Division, covered several key topics. First, she explained protein requirements for growing children. Children need approximately 1 to 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight daily, higher than adult requirements. Protein provides essential amino acids for tissue growth, immune function, and neurological development. Second, she described consequences of inadequate nutrition. Protein energy malnutrition leads to growth stunting, immune suppression, cognitive impairment, and increased mortality risk. Children are particularly vulnerable because their rapid growth creates high nutritional demands. Third, she demonstrated how common American foods met these requirements. A peanut butter sandwich, she explained, contains approximately 8 grams of protein and 300 calories, significant contributions toward daily needs. Combined with milk, fruit, and regular meals, such supplements could prevent malnutrition. Bennett used visual aids, charts showing nutritional content of various foods, photographs comparing healthy and malnourished children, and samples of recommended foods. Her presentation was factual and avoided emotional manipulation, following medical education best practices of the period. However, she recognized that scientific information alone would not overcome cultural resistance. Many internees had professional education and understood basic nutrition. The barrier was not knowledge but attitude, the belief that accepting American food meant accepting cultural inferiority. This is where camp administration's strategy became more nuanced. Rather than having only American personnel present, Captain Hayes invited internee leaders to participate. Specifically, she asked the mother whose daughter had collapsed the previous day to address the group. This approach aligned with principles of peer education, well documented in public health literature. People are more likely to change behaviors when influenced by trusted members of their own community rather than outsiders. The mother, a former teacher with credibility among other German internees, could speak with authority about the consequences of food refusal in ways an American nurse could not. The mother's testimony, reconstructed from camp administrative reports, focused on personal experience. She described her initial rejection of peanut butter, her organization of resistance among other internees, and her conviction that maintaining German food standards was essential to cultural identity. She then described watching her daughter collapse, seeing American medical intervention save her child's life, and recognizing that her ideology had nearly killed someone she loved. She did not ask for sympathy. Instead, she challenged other mothers to consider whether cultural pride was worth risking children's health. She presented letters from Germany describing starvation conditions. She argued that internees at Camp Crystal City had a privilege, access to adequate food, that their families in Germany desperately lacked, and that refusing this food was both foolish and disrespectful to those suffering real deprivation. Another internee, a former nurse, provided supporting testimony. She had received a letter from her sister in Berlin describing her twin son's deterioration from malnutrition. She admitted that for 3 months she had been discarding peanut butter rations while her children in Germany starved. She acknowledged that professional pride and cultural ideology had overridden both maternal instinct and medical knowledge. The effect of these testimonies, according to camp reports, was more powerful than any American presentation could have achieved. The women were hearing from peers, educated professionals from their own culture, who admitted catastrophic errors in judgment. This created social permission for others to reconsider their own positions. Camp administrators then moved to practical implementation. They announced immediate changes to supplemental feeding programs. All children under age 12 would be offered peanut butter sandwiches twice daily, along with milk. Participation was strongly encouraged, but technically voluntary. Mothers who attended nutrition classes would receive additional ration supplements to share with their children. Additionally, Lieutenant Bennett announced a cultural exchange program. She would teach American cooking techniques and food preparation. In exchange, she invited internee women to teach her traditional German recipes. The goal was reframing the situation not as American imposition, but as mutual learning. This approach reflected evolving War Department thinking about internee management. Earlier in the war, camp administration had been purely custodial, focused on security and basic welfare. By 1945, with victory achieved and attention shifting to post-war reconstruction, policy emphasized re-education and eventual reintegration. Teaching internees about American society, including food culture, was part of preparing them for eventual return to a world where American influence would be significant. The nutrition education session concluded with distribution of informational materials in German, pamphlets about child nutrition, recipe cards showing how to use peanut butter in various preparations, and guidelines for recognizing malnutrition symptoms. Camp administration also established open office hours where mothers could consult privately with medical staff about their children's health. Response to the session varied. Camp reports indicate that approximately 60% of German mothers began immediately participating in supplemental feeding programs. Another 25% participated reluctantly after several days. About 15% continued resisting, though few actively discouraged their children from eating when food was offered directly. This 85% acceptance rate represented significant behavior change in a population that had shown near-unanimous resistance just weeks earlier. Social psychology research on persuasion and behavior change suggests several factors contributed to this success. Concrete evidence of harmful consequences, trusted peer endorsement, preservation of dignity through educational rather than punitive framing, and practical support for implementing change. Post-war German internee re-education programs 1945, the nutrition intervention at Camp Crystal City, exemplified broader War Department policies regarding German internee management in 1945. As military victory became certain, American military and civilian authorities began planning for post-war occupation and reconstruction of Germany. This planning included consideration of how to handle the approximately 371,000 German prisoners and internees held on American soil. Policy documents from this period, now declassified, reveal debates about internee treatment. Some officials advocated purely custodial approaches, minimal interaction beyond basic humanitarian requirements. Others argued for active re-education programs designed to expose internees to democratic values and American culture before their eventual repatriation. The re-education approach ultimately prevailed, reflecting beliefs that post-war stability required fundamental changes in German political culture. President Truman's administration, continuing policies established under President Roosevelt, authorized expanded educational and cultural programs in internment camps. These programs varied but shared common elements. Camps offered classes in English language, American history, and democratic governance. They organized lectures by visiting speakers on topics including American economic systems, religious freedom, and civil liberties. They provided access to American newspapers, films, and radio programs, censored for security but otherwise representative of American media. Food education programs, like the one at Camp Crystal City, fit within this broader framework. They aimed not just at improving health outcomes, but at challenging cultural assumptions. The message was that American approaches to problems like food production and nutrition, characterized by mass production, efficiency, and practical innovation, had value worth considering, even if different from European traditions. This approach reflected beliefs about causes of German aggression. Many American policymakers and intellectuals in 1945 attributed Germany's embrace of totalitarianism partly to cultural factors: excessive nationalism, belief in racial and cultural superiority, rigid adherence to tradition, and rejection of pragmatic problem-solving. Re-education programs aim to counter these patterns. Critics, both contemporary and historical, have questioned these programs' assumptions and methods. Some argue they represented cultural imperialism, imposing American values on defeated populations. Others suggest they oversimplified complex causes of political extremism. Still others contend they had limited lasting impact compared to material factors like economic reconstruction. Nevertheless, the programs represented serious effort to use the internment period constructively. Rather than simply warehousing prisoners until they could be repatriated, American authorities attempted to prepare them for return to a Germany that would be fundamentally transformed by occupation and reconstruction. Effectiveness varied by individual and circumstance. Some internees embraced exposure to American culture, learned English fluently, and later described their internment as unexpectedly educational. Others remained hostile, viewing re-education attempts as enemy propaganda. Most probably fell somewhere in between, taking what seemed useful while maintaining core identities. The nutrition crisis at camps like Crystal City provided unexpected opportunities for re-education. The contrast between food security in American captivity and starvation in Germany made concrete points that abstract lectures could not. When internees' own families wrote describing desperate hunger, while they themselves had access to adequate food, it undermined simplistic narratives about American inferiority. Lieutenant Bennett's approach, combining medical facts with cultural sensitivity, using peer educators, and framing cooperation as practical wisdom rather than ideological capitulation, exemplified successful re-education methods. She achieved behavior change not through coercion, but through creating conditions where internees could reconsider previous positions without losing face. By late 1945, medical records from Camp Crystal City showed improvement in child health metrics. The 7 children previously identified as malnourished had gained weight. No new cases of serious malnutrition were reported. Internee mothers increasingly participated in nutrition programs and cooking classes. Some even requested additional information about American food preparation to take back to Germany. Family reunification displaced Germans. 1945-1946 A's 1945. Progressed toward conclusion, Camp Crystal City faced new challenges related to family reunification. Millions of Germans were displaced by war's end. Refugees from eastern territories, evacuees from bombed cities, separated family members scattered across Europe. American and Allied authorities attempted to reunite families when possible, including bringing family members to join internees in American camps. This process was complex and slow. It required identifying displaced persons, verifying family relationships, arranging transportation across war-devastated Europe, and processing paperwork through military and civilian bureaucracies. Priority generally went to reuniting children with parents and providing care for vulnerable populations. Camp Crystal City received numerous family reunification cases in late 1945 and early 1946. Wives and children of interned German nationals, previously in displaced persons camps in Germany and France, were transported to Texas. These arrivals included many children showing effects of prolonged malnutrition. Medical screening of new arrivals revealed serious health problems. Children often arrived significantly underweight, with multiple micronutrient deficiencies, poor dental health, and delayed development. These conditions reflected months or years of inadequate nutrition in war-disrupted Europe. The camp's established nutrition programs proved essential for addressing these cases. Children were enrolled immediately in supplemental feeding protocols. Medical staff provided intensive monitoring. The educational groundwork laid earlier, internee mothers' acceptance of American nutritional approaches, facilitated rapid intervention without the resistance that had complicated earlier efforts. One documented case involved twin 5-year-old boys who arrived from Berlin in September 1945 to join their mother, a nurse interned at the camp. Medical examination revealed severe protein-calorie malnutrition. The boys weighed 28 and 29 pounds, roughly 10 to 12 pounds below expected weight for their age. They showed muscle wasting, edema, and extreme fatigue. Intervention began immediately. The boys received high-calorie, high-protein diets, including peanut butter sandwiches, milk, eggs, and fortified foods. Medical staff monitored them daily. Their mother, who had initially resisted American foods but had later recognized their value, cooperated fully with treatment protocols. Recovery occurred gradually over several months. By December 1945, medical records show the boys had gained significant weight and strength. They began participating in camp school and recreation activities. By March 1946, they had reached normal weight ranges for their ages and showed no remaining signs of malnutrition. This case and others like it provided additional evidence supporting the nutrition program's value. Internee women could see concrete results, children arriving sick and departing healthy. The transformation was visible and undeniable, reinforcing acceptance of medical protocols. Camp Crystal City operated until February 1948, when the last internees were repatriated to Germany. Over its operational period, approximately 3,000 German and Japanese internees passed through the facility. Medical records indicate that the child malnutrition problem, serious in early 1945, was substantially resolved by late 1945 and did not recur at significant levels thereafter. Historical assessment. American POW policy. 1945 American treatment of German prisoners and internees during World War II has been subject to extensive historical analysis. Compared to conditions in other nations' custody, Germans held in the United States generally experienced relatively humane treatment, though significant variations and problems existed. The United States held approximately 371,000 German military prisoners of war in camps across the continental United States, plus additional civilian internees. The War Department administered POW camps under provisions of the 1929 Geneva Convention, which established minimum standards for prisoner treatment. Compliance with Geneva Convention requirements was generally good, though not perfect. International Red Cross inspection reports document that American POW camps typically provided adequate food, shelter, medical care, and opportunities for recreation and religious observance. Labor programs employed prisoners in agriculture and other non-military work with compensation as required by the convention. Food provided to German POWs in American camps exceeded rations available to German civilians and often exceeded American civilian rations during periods of domestic rationing. This reflected both Geneva Convention requirements and practical abundance. American agricultural productivity and distribution systems maintained food security throughout the war despite military demands. Mortality rates among German POWs in American custody were low. Exact figures vary by source, but scholarly estimates place the death rate at approximately 0.15%, roughly 560 deaths among 371,000 prisoners. Most deaths resulted from pre-existing medical conditions, accidents, or natural causes, rather than mistreatment. This contrasts sharply with much higher mortality rates in German and Soviet custody of prisoners. However, American POW administration was not without problems. Documentation exists of isolated abuses, inadequate supervision at some camps, labor safety issues, and occasional violence. German prisoners attempting escape could be shot under military protocols. Some camps faced overcrowding and resource shortages, particularly early in the war before systems were fully developed. Treatment of Japanese prisoners and internees followed different patterns, often more restrictive due to security concerns and racial prejudice prevalent in 1940s America. Japanese Americans faced mass incarceration without individual evidence of disloyalty, a policy later officially acknowledged as unjust and resulting in reparations. The nutrition crisis at Camp Crystal City and similar facilities illustrated gaps between policy and implementation. While food supplies were adequate, cultural factors and inadequate education initially prevented effective nutrition, particularly for children. The situation improved when camp administration recognized the problem and implemented comprehensive responses. This episode also illustrated broader challenges of internment and occupation. Even well-intentioned policies could produce unintended negative consequences when cultural differences were not adequately understood and addressed. Effective administration required not just providing resources, but ensuring their use through education and cultural adaptation. Conclusion: American Homefront World War II, 1945. The incident at Camp Crystal City in July 1945 occurred against the backdrop of a nation transitioning from total war to uncertain peace. By mid-1945, victory in Europe had been achieved. Victory in the Pacific would follow in August. The United States faced massive challenges of demobilization, economic reconversion, and occupation responsibilities in defeated enemy nations. American home front during World War II had been characterized by unprecedented mobilization. Industrial production increased dramatically to supply military needs. Approximately 16 million Americans served in the armed forces. Civilian population accepted rationing, labor mobilization, and restrictions on civil liberties considered necessary for security. The home front also included less examined aspects like operation of prisoner of war camps. Over 700 such camps operated across the United States during the war, holding primarily German and Italian prisoners, in addition to smaller numbers of Japanese POWs. These camps were distributed across rural areas where labor was needed and security concerns were minimal. Camp operation presented complex challenges, maintaining security, meeting humanitarian obligations, utilizing prisoner labor productively, preventing escapes, and managing cultural differences. The War Department developed extensive protocols and training programs for camp personnel. The effort required thousands of military and civilian staff members. For American military personnel assigned to camp duty, including medical staff like Lieutenant Bennett, the work combined routine administration with unexpected challenges. Medical personnel dealt with diseases, injuries, psychological problems, and nutritional issues. They worked to maintain health standards while navigating cultural barriers and sometimes hostile populations. The specific challenge of child malnutrition in internment camps arose from intersection of adequate resources and cultural resistance. It illustrated broader truth about public health. Providing resources is necessary, but not sufficient. Effective health outcomes require that populations accept and properly use available resources. This often demands cultural education and behavior change, more difficult than simple provision of food or medicine. Resolution of the Camp Crystal City nutrition crisis demonstrated effective problem-solving. Camp administration recognized a serious problem, developed multifaceted response combining medical intervention with cultural education, leveraged peer influence to overcome resistance, and monitored results to ensure effectiveness. The approach succeeded in changing behaviors and improving health outcomes. The incident also illustrated human capacity for reassessing beliefs when confronted with consequences. The German internee mothers who initially refused American food based on cultural ideology later accepted it when their children's health was at stake. This change required courage, admitting error publicly, and accepting help from former enemies. It also required camp administration that created opportunities for change without humiliation or coercion. These lessons extended beyond Camp Crystal City. American occupation authorities in Germany and Japan after 1945 would face similar challenges: populations devastated by war, resistant to occupiers' influence, needing both material assistance and cultural adaptation. Success required not just imposing solutions, but creating conditions where occupied populations could accept change while maintaining dignity. The mother who initially led resistance to American food at Camp Crystal City later became an advocate for nutrition education. Camp records indicate she regularly participated in orientation sessions for newly arrived internees, sharing her experience and encouraging cooperation with medical programs. This transformation from opponent to partner exemplified successful re-education. By 1948, when Camp Crystal City closed and remaining internees were repatriated to Germany, the nutrition programs had prevented serious malnutrition among hundreds of children. Medical staff had provided care that likely saved lives and prevented permanent developmental damage. The programs had also facilitated broader cultural education about American society and values. The repatriated internees returned to a Germany transformed by defeat and occupation. The country they left was Nazi Germany, confident in its superiority and engaged in aggressive war. The country they returned to was divided, occupied, devastated, and beginning slow process of rebuilding under Allied supervision. Some internees' experiences in American camps, including lessons about pragmatism over ideology, may have helped them navigate this transformation. Historical assessment of World War II naturally focuses on combat operations, strategic decisions, and major political events. The home front, including operation of internment camps, receives less attention. Yet these experiences also shaped the war's meaning and legacy. They tested American values under stress. They demonstrated capacity for humanitarian treatment of enemies while maintaining security. They prepared foundation for post-war reconciliation. The Camp Crystal City nutrition incident was minor compared to war's massive tragedies, yet it contained elements that resonated with broader themes: the cost of ideology when taken to extremes, the importance of practical problem-solving over abstract principles, the need for cultural understanding in international relations, and the human capacity for learning and change even in difficult circumstances. These themes remained relevant long after World War II ended. They apply to any situation where cultural differences, ideology, and practical necessities intersect. The lessons learned in a Texas internment camp in 1945 about the dangers of cultural superiority, the value of pragmatism, and the importance of focusing on human welfare rather than abstract principles continue to inform thinking about international relations, cultural exchange, and humanitarian assistance. Lieutenant Bennett, Captain Hayes, and other American personnel at Camp Crystal City performed duties that received little recognition but contributed to the war effort's larger purposes. They maintained security. They provided humanitarian care. They attempted, sometimes successfully, to demonstrate American values in practice rather than just rhetoric. Their work, documented in military records and medical files, was part of the vast, complex operation that was American home front during World War II. The German internees at Camp Crystal City experienced war from an unusual perspective. They were enemies held captive, yet treated with relative humanity. They faced privation, yet had access to resources exceeding what their families in Germany experienced. They resisted American culture, yet some eventually recognized value in American pragmatism and openness. Their experiences were part of the complex process through which enmity gradually transformed into post-war cooperation and eventual alliance. One child, unconscious from malnutrition in July 1945, recovered through medical intervention and appropriate nutrition. By 1946, she was healthy. By 1948, she returned to Germany with her mother. Her later life is not documented in available records, but she survived, which was the immediate goal. The intervention that saved her also catalyzed changes that helped other children. This represented a small but meaningful success in the vast disruption and tragedy that was World War II.